Trans things in the UK have gone pretty wayward recently, and unfortunately a very vocal, very powerful minority have had a large negative impact on trans rights. On April 16th this year, the Supreme Court in the UK made a ruling that the definition of a woman for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010 will be based on biological sex. It's important to note that this was a ruling just based on the definition for the purposes of the Equality Act, not generally within society, and the Supreme Court specified that they were not wading in on this conversation. So this isn't great, right? For multiple different reasons, for multiple different communities of people, particularly trans women right now. So how did this all start in the first place? How did we end up here? Well, the Supreme Court case was the culmination of challenges against the Scottish government from a TERF group. It reportedly started with a bill passed in 2018 that was designed to ensure gender balance on public sector boards, but the TERF group was too wrapped up in their transphobia to even see this as the positive thing that it was, and they essentially think that the protected characteristic of woman should only apply if you're assigned female at birth. But the Scottish government said that trans people should be included, e.g. trans women should be protected as women. Funny that, given that they are women. The case went through the Scottish courts until it was brought to the Supreme Court, and now the ruling is not only limited to Scottish law, but impacts the interpretation of the Equality Act that applies across the whole of the United Kingdom. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of the general path of how we ended up here. The TERF group had to fundraise to bring this case to the Supreme Court, and they raised about £230,000, £70,000 of which came from very well-known TERF, J.K. Rowling. It's really important to stress here as well that the Supreme Court, in this ruling, refused to hear from any trans people. How could you make such a massive ruling that will have such a huge impact on a specific group within society without hearing from that specific group? It makes no sense, and it just reeks of hypocrisy and being blinded by bigotry. After the ruling, TERFs could be seen celebrating with what appears to be champagne outside the Supreme Court, as if their favourite sports team had just won their match. Very bizarre. And J.K. Rowling tweeted multiple things, and one that has become particularly notorious is a photo of her on her super yacht smoking a cigar with a glass of, again, what seems to be alcohol, commenting, "I love it when a plan comes together." They think they've won because they've opened up trans people to be discriminated against, and they've opened up for the exclusion of trans people within social spaces. But in reality, they've also opened up cis women to be discriminated against in those same situations, and any cis person actually who is gender non-conforming, which in reality will include some people who are TERFs, and all of these people are now more likely to be harassed in gendered public spaces such as toilets and changing rooms. Because funnily enough, you can't always tell when people are trans. So whilst their smugness is pretty vile, they also look incredibly stupid to anybody with an ounce of common sense and compassion towards the trans community. They think this was a win for cis women and a win for feminism, when in reality it was just a campaign of hate that's ended up being partially an own goal. Yes, you've excluded trans people, but you've also put cis women at a high risk now as well. Cis women who are more masculine presenting are already harassed within public spaces such as restrooms and changing rooms, and will now more than ever be expected to prove their biological womanness. And how does one do that exactly? Definitely not in a way that is feminist and protects women. This whole concept and the ruling of boiling people down to, and specifically women, down to their biology is so incredibly reductionist. It reduces people down to chromosomes, which we can't see, reproductive organs, which are not consistent and can be removed, genitalia, which again is not consistent and can be changed. Trans women can have a vagina and trans men can have a penis. So what is it they are relying on for this basis of biological sex? And in reality, it just means that this ruling and the transphobia not only puts trans people at such a greatly increased risk and reduces our rights, but also puts any cis person who's gender non-conforming, and particularly cis women, at risk as well. This ruling in transphobia actually has the potential to put cis women at more risk than they are currently at now. So not only are trans people now at more risk, particularly trans women who are the main target of this hateful campaign, but also now the very group that the TERFs built their whole argument upon protecting. Make it make sense. The only way it makes sense is it's just bigotry. They're not protecting anybody. Now, we shouldn't really need to be in a position or prove that cis people are now going to be harmed by transphobia. It should have always been enough that trans people are harmed by transphobia, but unfortunately, this is the situation we're in right now. And being able to show people who were mildly TERFy or on the side of the TERFs that, hey, wait, actually, they're telling you they're feminists and they're doing this to protect cis women, but literally literally what they are doing is nothing more than transphobia that will actually also harm cis women. That's just where we're at. So obviously I'm here recognizing that trans people are the most impacted, particularly trans women, particularly trans people who are early on in their transitions. But on top of that, this is really solid examples of how cis women are impacted by transphobia as well. For example, since the ruling, the Transport Police in the UK has now said that trans women will be strip searched by male officers. But how will they know who is a trans woman? This really just feels like it's giving people the freedom to say,
hey, I think you're a trans woman, prove me wrong.
Strip search them when they can't be proved wrong, and then even after they're strip searched, there's no way to prove whether somebody is actually a cis woman or a trans woman, because as mentioned above, there are surgeries available to trans women. Trans people can also change all of their ID documentations like passports and birth certificates, so having an F on any documents is not going to prove to an officer or anybody else accusing somebody of being a trans woman that they're a cis woman. But again, this shouldn't need to be something that is now impacting cis women for it to be a problem. And then generally, how does putting rules in place that allows people to overly scrutinize any woman and any woman's femininity protect any woman? The answer is, it doesn't. It just puts all women at greater risk. And the TERFs have made this a reality. The exact opposite of feminism. The exact opposite of the feminism they claim to be doing and having. TERFs will argue that excluding trans women from women's spaces will make cis women safer. Partly because it will stop cis men from being able to pretend that they're trans women and then accessing these women's spaces. In reality, trans women have been using women's spaces in public for decades without issue. There's no evidence that trans women using women's spaces put cis women at any greater risk. There's also no evidence that cis men are pretending to be trans women to gain access to these spaces. So it's a threat that's been totally made up by transphobes in the first place. And it's just acting as a distraction to the real threat, which is predatory cis men, not trans people. And we should be focusing on the areas and situations where women are most at risk from these predatory cis men, including trans women who are at a very great risk of violence, instead of saying that it's trans women that are the problem. They're just being used as a scapegoat and a distraction from the real issue. I don't understand how anybody can claim to be feminist and be transphobic. They do not go together. This whole attack was aimed towards trans women. A majority of the transphobia we see is aimed towards trans women, who are the most vulnerable group here. Those campaigning clearly forgot that trans men exist, because defining the term woman in the Equality Act under biological sex, they're inadvertently including trans men under the definition of women, and therefore offering the same protections to trans men that women get. I don't think TERFs even thought about this, and neither did a lot of people, as can be shown in this clip right here.
Trans men then have to use women's toilets. That's going to make women less safe, because how are you going to stop a man, a normal man, going into a woman's toilets and saying, I'm a trans man? And so I think we have to look at that's
just follow that logic.
Why?
Because the point is that we're saying that people who are biologically men shouldn't be using women's toilets. That's the point of this ruling, among other things.
But a trans man is biologically a woman.
Someone who's transitioned from being a woman to a man is...
And so they would then have to use women's toilets.
I think this...
By defining access to gendered spaces based on biological birth sex, you are pushing trans men into women's spaces. Question: do you think it's easier for a cis man to pretend to be a trans woman to gain access to a women's bathroom, or pretend to be a trans man, where he literally would not need to do anything? Because in my day-to-day life, if I don't tell people I'm a trans man, they all assume I'm a cis man. If I walked into a woman's space, people would assume I'm a cis man entering that space. What is stopping a cis man from doing that and saying he's a trans man? On top of that as well, away from the trans discussion, it's all just absolutely ridiculous, but so many spaces, including like changing rooms and toilets in public places like shopping centres in the UK, will have signs on them that are like, just letting you know, this bathroom may be attended by staff of any gender. meaning that predatory cis men who wanted to go in a woman's bathroom never needed to be trans at all. Trans women, trans man, forget it, didn't even need to go near pretending to be trans, just had to pretend to be a cleaning staff or maintenance staff. Or, guess what, because there's no lock on these bathrooms, there's nobody at the door checking people's genitalia, they can just walk in. That is what a predatory cis man would do if they wanted to gain access. They would just walk in. They would not pretend to be a trans woman. Plus, you'd think that the TERFs that were so concerned about cis women's safety and men accessing women's spaces would have brought it up as a point that cleaning and maintenance and staff in these public facilities of any gender can enter the women's bathrooms and other facilities. That is not something I've ever seen a TERF mention or care about. I know this is really heavy, so I want to pivot slightly in a more positive direction, because what I can say that's happened since this ruling and that I've seen as a trans man, it has driven home to me more and more how much of a minority this level of transphobia is, and how much it is just a really loud, unfortunately powerful and rich minority, and that's why they've gained traction. However, a minority. Since the judgment, the level of support for the trans community that I've seen is the biggest I have ever seen in the UK since I've started creating content since I came out as trans. Major celebrities are speaking up and raising money, including Nicola Coughlan, who helped raise more than £100,000 for the trans charity Not a Phase, Pedro Pascal, who's called J.K. Rowling a heinous loser, so accurate, and worn a Protect the Dolls t-shirt on a red carpet and continues to share things in support of the trans community on his profile. On top of this, the Good Law Project has started a crowdfunder to challenge the Supreme Court's judgment. In just a week, they have raised more money than the TERF group did for their Supreme Court case, and this was without the platform and the financial backing of a billionaire with 14 million followers. As of the day I'm making this, they've raised over £250,000 from over 7,000 donations. That's £20,000 more than the TERF group raised, and from 2,000 more people donating. And this Good Law Project fundraiser has only just started. So please go click the link in my description box to check out the fundraiser, donate if you can, share it if you can't, any little thing helps. In the fundraiser, they called out the UK's Equality Minister, Bridget Phillipson, who said that toilets are to be used based on biological sex. She also stated, the ruling was clear that provisions and services should be accessed on the basis of biological sex. And she stated further that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, will be setting out additional guidance and a statutory code of practice, because we need to make sure that everyone has the ability to access services that are safe and appropriate and respect their privacy and dignity. We're going to have a chat about the EHRC guidance, where interim guidance has now come out, in just a moment. Quick spoiler though, it is absolutely atrocious and not in line with protecting trans people's privacy and dignity. And she's not the only member of the government to bow down to the bigots, with Prime Minister Keir Starmer also showing that he'd prefer to listen to a shouty minority over and above the actual community being impacted. Since the ruling, he's said, the Supreme Court has made it clear that when looking at the Equality Act, a woman is a biological woman. And he said that the court provided clarity. What clarity, honestly? Things are literally more confusing and more dangerous for trans people and non-conforming cis people than they were before this ruling. It literally doesn't make sense. Anybody who thinks that this brought clarity just knows nothing about the trans community. He could have maintained what he said back in March 2022 in that trans women are women, but now he seems to have backtracked on that, and that is unsurprising but incredibly disappointing. The next development that happened was the EHRC guidance, which came out very, very late, about 10 PM on Friday 25th of April. They released interim guidance for organisations following the Supreme Court ruling. They said the Supreme Court judgment has implications for many organisations in terms of trans people's access to gendered spaces, including workplaces and services that are open to the public, such as hospitals, shops, refuges, counselling services, etc., as well as sporting bodies, schools and associations. The guidance for the above spaces is that trans women should not be permitted to use the women's facilities and trans men should not be permitted to use the men's facilities, stating that otherwise single-sex spaces would no longer be single-sex. But in this context, what is sex being based on? When they say that these spaces will no longer be single-sex, what do they mean by sex? Are they talking about chromosomes, something that we can't see, and it's not that uncommon for them to turn out to not be what people expect them to be? Genitalia, things that we don't and shouldn't see in a public place, and that can be changed with surgery. What about reproductive organs? That again, we can't see and aren't always in line with what you'd expect and can be surgically removed, not just for trans people, but for cis people as well. And then what about secondary sex characteristics such as breasts, facial hair, voice deepening, body hair, etc.? They can all be changed through hormones. And even for many cis people, such as cis women with PCOS, they don't all always line up with what you would typically expect. Sex is not black and white like the transphobes want to think it is. Basically, all elements of sex can be changed or removed aside from chromosomes. Are we really going to start boiling people down to their chromosomes now? I don't think very many people even know their chromosomes. Plus, trans people can legally change their sex in the UK, which is something that is not really being discussed very much. And intersex people exist. Nobody seems to give a shit about them. Nobody seems to have even taken 1 second consideration for people who are intersex right now. Gender nonconformity also exists. How will a masculine presenting cis woman prove to somebody harassing her in a public space that she is not a trans woman? Why should a trans woman be harassed when trying to use a public facility? What do these transphobes expect to happen to trans women who are forced into men's bathrooms? How can they not see the danger that those trans women will be put in? And what about trans men who can have a deep voice and facial hair, a flat chest, and sometimes even a penis? How do you think women will feel about him being in their space? Although the EHRC has tried to cover for this by saying, in some circumstances, the law also allows trans women not to be permitted to use the men's facilities and trans men not to be permitted to use the women's facilities. It's not entirely clear what these circumstances might be, but they've essentially opened it up to trans people being excluded from any single gender space. Not that trans men will want to be using the women's and not that trans women will want to be using the men's, but they've basically just gone,
oh yeah, you've got us there, trans people. We don't really know how to explain the whole like trans men in women's spaces. Okay, fine, trans men don't get to use women's spaces either.
Like, you've just excluded trans people from a large part of public life. This means that any trans person that would actually adhere to these ridiculous guidelines, or is forced to adhere by these guidelines, such as in places like their workplace or school, will have to out themselves by going to a gender neutral space. However, not everywhere offers gender neutral options. Most places I go to don't. So excuse me whilst I just take a piss in my chamber pot in the middle of the supermarket. The Equalities Watchdog has come under pressure to scrap this awful guidance as it risks outing trans people and breaching human rights, including leaving them with no place to go to the toilet or having to go really far out of their way to find those neutral facilities. To myself as a trans person, this would appear to be incompatible with trans people's rights. And the Supreme Court ruling did say that the ruling would not impact the legal protections against discrimination for trans people. So how is forcing us to come out by using completely separate, segregated facilities not a form of discrimination? How is forcing us to not be able to use public facilities when there are no gender neutral options, which is really common, not a form of discrimination? How is making trans people feel fearful of going out in public in case they cannot find appropriate facilities not discrimination? You cannot discriminate against trans people and then say, oh, but trans people are still protected. And plus, just a little reminder to you what the Equalities Minister said earlier, we need to make sure that everyone has the ability to access services that are safe and appropriate and respect their privacy and dignity. Tell me how trans people's safety, privacy, and dignity are being respected at all right now. Spoiler, they're not. Also, as a reminder, cis men who are cleaning or maintenance or other kinds of staff can still access women's spaces freely and easily. And plus, cis men who are not allowed to access those women's spaces because they're not members of staff will still access those spaces if they want to, and not by pretending to be a trans person, just by walking in. But God forbid a trans woman wants to pee. And honestly, how do they even expect this guidance to be enforced? The only people who think this can be enforced are the ones who are fully believing that they can always tell when someone's trans. Newsflash, you can't always tell. Many trans people are read as cis, and many cis people are read as trans. Because sex is not black and white, gender is not black and white, gender expression is not black and white. This is literally a move away from equality for not just trans people, but also women. And the TERFs are too rotted from their hatred to see it. Or maybe they can see it, but they just don't care, and they really genuinely are maliciously pretending to be feminists to just cover up their transphobia and make it look better than it really is. If they weren't so horrible, I would actually pity these hardcore TERFs. Because imagine dedicating huge amounts of your life and your time and your money and your energy and everything to being hateful towards trans people. It's honestly so pathetic. These awful people will go down as arseholes in the history books. Trans rights are clearly being stripped away right now in the UK through a combination of malice and ignorance. From the Supreme Court ruling to the EHRC guidance, there has been a clear lack of decision makers actually listening to and speaking to trans people or even trans allies. Like, come on. But people are fighting back. We are not losing hope. If this has proved anything, it's proved that it's a vocal minority and we just need to keep pushing back until we overthrow their shittiness. Allies are speaking up. The Good Law Project are fundraising to fight against the Supreme Court ruling. On top of this, the Green Party in the UK has called for the EHRC to withdraw its guidance. Some Labour MPs have signed a pledge against the Supreme Court ruling. Doctors at the British Medical Association have condemned the Supreme Court ruling and called it biologically nonsensical and scientifically illiterate. Again, sex is not black and white. You cannot boil people down to their chromosomes and their body parts. We don't work like that. The UK's first transgender judge is taking the UK to the European Court of Human Rights over the Supreme Court ruling. There were also over 30 protests that happened across the UK just after the ruling, with the biggest estimated turnout being 25,000 people at a single event in London, and thousands more showing up across the country. This is in comparison to the half dozen or so TERFs that were drinking champagne outside of the Supreme Court. So you tell me where the love is. I want to finish this video with some bits on how you watching this video can help. I hope that this video in of itself has been useful, maybe given you some tools, given you some information, explained the top level of what's going on right now in the UK. But there's definitely stuff that you can be doing, both as a trans and a cis person, to get involved. But I'm mostly going to be speaking to cis allies right now because honestly, trans people, I just want you to look after yourself, surround yourself by people who care about you because they are out there. Go watch your favorite movie, do something that brings you happiness and joy, because you do not deserve what is going on right now and you do not deserve to be brought down by the haters. I am a firm believer that it's going to be okay and we're going to get through this shit. So cis allies, please be an ally right now. Use your voice where you can, whether that's on a public platform or just in your circles, in your day-to-day life. Stick by your trans friends and family members, maybe even offer to be a bathroom buddy for them if that would make them feel safer right now. I've definitely seen some trans women online saying that they are absolutely going to need a bathroom buddy at the moment and they don't feel safe using public spaces. Sign petitions, donate to fundraisers or share fundraisers if you can't donate yourself. Write to your MP, write to the EHRC to tell them how awful the guidance is and how much harm is being caused right now. I've left links in the description box to the relevant things to help with the suggestions above, including templates for writing to the EHRC to make it easier and links to donation pages, etc. So please check them out and get involved as much as you can. Also, trans people, if you can, get yourself a bunch of a trans person P-tier sticker or just something to show trans presence in public spaces and just use them, as well as all of the above things that I just mentioned as well. I know this has been really heavy. I thought it was really important to address it in a longer form video because I've made a lot of short stuff about it. I hope it was useful. I'm sure even by the time I post this video, more stuff is going to have happened, more money's going to be raised, probably more negative things going to have come out, but hopefully some more positive things will have come out. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, think about giving a thumbs up and subscribing. Share it with people if you want to help them understand more. Go comment down below, help me boost the algorithm. I also have a Patreon if you want to go check out that and support me there, but no pressure. I'd much rather you focus on the other things I shouted out, but I just want to say thank you to my Patreons and thank you to my top tier Patreons. It really means a lot. I truly appreciate all of you. Chloe, Night Soul, Jill B, Nesta, Sugar Joe, Ioana Balash, Eldon K, Rye Loves Rory, The Third Hatman, Jaden Cricket, Max Mix Mods, and River Champagne Mod. Thanks again for watching and I will see you next time. Much love. Bye.